A lonely cowboy in the harsh Montana territory stands at a graveside, clutching his late friend's letter. The will demands one last wish: marry a woman he has never met. With dread in his heart, he sets out, believing he's walking into a trap of misery. But fate has other plans. Montana territory in the 1870s was a land where the wind never rested, where dust carried whispers of broken promises and gunfire echoed across the wide prairies. In this unforgiving place lived Daniel Carter, a rugged rancher in his 30s, a man whose strength was tested daily by wild storms and harsher memories. His closest friend, Samuel, had been the only person who truly knew the weight Daniel carried in silence. But death came suddenly, cruelly taking Samuel in a tragic accident. At the graveside, Daniel stood alone, his rough hands holding a folded will, the last words of the friend he had sworn to never fail. The letter contained one final request that made his heart heavy with dread: to marry a woman he had never met. Daniel's eyes lingered on the fading horizon, torn between loyalty to the dead and the haunting fear of binding his life to a stranger. The paper trembled in Daniel's hands as though the weight of Samuel's words were heavier than the Montana earth itself. For the will carried not just property or cattle, but a vow that could not be ignored. A vow that demanded Daniel marry a woman he had never once laid eyes on, a woman named Clara, a distant relative Samuel had sworn must be protected. And as Daniel read the lines again under the fading light of the cabin lamp, he felt his chest tighten with a fear he could not confess aloud. For marriage had never been his plan. Not now, not ever. And certainly not with a stranger, whose name felt as foreign as the winds that swept the plains. Yet the bond of friendship was sacred, stronger than blood. And Samuel had trusted him with this final duty, leaving Daniel torn between the loyalty of a promise and the dread of surrendering his freedom. And whispers from town only deepened his unease, for every voice that spoke Clara's name painted her as cold, sharp, and difficult, a woman said to have driven others away with her silence and her fire. And though Daniel had faced storms that swallowed entire barns, wolves that prowled the edges of his land, and men who drew their pistols without warning, none of it brought the same hollow ache of dread that this unseen marriage did. For how could he build a life beside someone he feared would never welcome him, never understand the wounds he carried? And still the memory of Samuel's hand on his shoulder before death claimed him burned like a brand, reminding Daniel that some promises must be kept no matter the cost. So with the bitter taste of fear in his mouth, and the restless sound of coyotes in the distance, he folded the will and slid it into his coat, his jaw tight, his heart unsteady. And though the ranch walls around him felt smaller than they ever had before, he knew there was no turning back. For the road ahead was carved by loyalty to a dead man's wish and shadowed by the unknown face of a woman who might ruin his life or perhaps alter it forever. The morning Daniel left his ranch, the sky was heavy with clouds that carried the promise of rain, and by the time he crossed the first ridge, the storm had already begun to break across the open land, sheets of water drenching him until his coat clung like a second skin. Yet he pressed on, driven not by desire but by duty, his horse laboring through mud and wind as each mile carried him further from the world he knew, and closer to the woman whose face haunted his imagination. For every tale he had heard about her sharpened the fear that she would be unkind, bitter, and waiting with scorn for a husband she had not chosen. And in the long nights, when he camped beneath the dripping branches, he stared into the fire and wondered if this road was the path to ruin, if Samuel had unknowingly condemned him to a loveless bond that would break them both. But still he rode, because turning back would have meant breaking the last tie of loyalty to the man who had trusted him beyond death. And at last, after days of cold rain and endless prairie, Daniel found himself before a weathered cabin that leaned against the storm as though it, too, had known suffering. And he sat for a long while on his horse staring at the door, his chest burning with dread, before finally dismounting, his boots sinking into the wet earth as he approached, every step echoing with the sound of fate drawing near. And when his knuckles rapped softly against the wood, the silence on the other side seemed endless until the latch lifted and the door opened. And there she stood, not the harsh figure of rumor, but a woman, whose weary eyes carried both strength and sorrow, her hands rough from labor, her shoulders bearing invisible weight. Yet in her posture was dignity, and in her gaze, a quiet fire that spoke of battles fought alone. And Daniel, still dripping rain, found himself unable to speak at once, because the woman before him was nothing like the shadow he had feared. For there was no bitterness in her voice when she greeted him, only caution. And though her guard was high, her presence was steady. And in that first meeting, Daniel realized that whatever lay ahead would not be the misery he had imagined, but something far more complex, something that stirred uneasily within his chest as the storm raged behind him, and the door slowly closed on the world he had left behind. The days that followed were marked by a silence that pressed harder than the storms Daniel had ridden through, for at the small wooden table their meals passed with only the clatter of cutlery and the low hiss of the fire. Clara's eyes fixed on her plate while Daniel's thoughts circled endlessly around the promise that had bound him to her, and though he tried to speak at times, his words fell short as if swallowed by the walls that separated them, more than distance ever could. For she believed deep down that he had taken her hand not out of choice but out of pity, and that belief lay heavy in every glance she avoided, while Daniel carried his own torment, guilt gnawing at him because loyalty to Samuel had driven him here, not the stirring of his own heart, and the loneliness he had known for years now felt doubled, for he was not only alone within himself, but alone even in the company of the woman he had sworn to stand beside, and as if their hearts were not burdened enough, the land itself rose against them with bitter force. Skies breaking into violent snow that crushed fences and buried feed, debts piling higher as creditors knocked at the door demanding payment Daniel could not yet make, and neighbors who had once tipped their hats grew hostile, some jealous of the land, others testing his resolve with quiet threats and poisoned words, leaving Daniel to stand guard long into the night with rifle across his knees, the shadows of the prairie stretching endless before him, and though Clara worked beside him, carrying water, mending clothes, tending what little garden could grow in such unforgiving soil, her silence cut deeper than any storm, for every kindness she gave seemed guarded, wrapped in the fear that he did not truly want her, and Daniel, watching her hands tremble when she thought he was not looking, felt a frustration he could not voice, for he longed to tell her that though this marriage had begun as duty, something within him was shifting like ice breaking on a river, yet pride and doubt kept his mouth shut, and so they lived side by side but apart, two souls tethered by a promise neither fully understood, with hardship at every corner, and a future that seemed to hold more shadows than light. The night the prairie storm struck, the sky tore itself apart with thunder that rolled like cannon fire, rain lashing the earth until the yard turned to rivers of mud, and Daniel, rushing to the barn with lantern in hand, realized with horror that the corral gates had broken under the force of wind, and the horses were fighting against the rising water, their wild eyes flashing in the storm's fury. And before he could wade through the flood, Clara was already there, her skirts soaked, her hair plastered against her face as she fought, the current with a rope in her hands, her small frame braced against the surge as she tied, the gait with strength born of pure will, and Daniel froze for a heartbeat at the sight, not of the storm, not of the danger, but of the unyielding courage in her every movement, for while lightning split the sky and the ground, shook beneath the pounding hooves, she stood her ground and pulled until the last gate held, saving the horses from being swept away into the darkness. And when Daniel finally reached her side, the rope had torn her palm raw, blood mingling with rain as she staggered. Yet she did not complain, did not falter, only gave a small nod that the animals were safe before her knees buckled, and Daniel caught her against his chest, the heat of her trembling body shocking against the cold storm. And for the first time he felt more than duty. He felt fear of losing her, fear that cut deeper than any debt or enemy. So he carried her inside and set her near the fire, his hands shaking as he gently unwrapped the torn cloth from her hand, and when he cleaned the wound his touch was softer than he knew himself capable of, his voice low as he whispered words, meant not to heal the skin, but the silence between them, telling her she was stronger than any storm he had known, and she, though weary, lifted her eyes to his with something unspoken yet powerful, a trust that had not been there before, and as the firelight danced across their faces, the walls that had kept them apart began to crumble, not with grand gestures, but with the simple truth of shared struggle, the fragile tenderness of a man binding, the hand of a woman who had saved what he could not, and in that quiet moment, Daniel no longer saw Clara as the stranger Samuel had left behind, but as the heart that might hold his world together, if he only found the courage to let her in. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the hush of the cabin, the fire throwing a soft glow as Clara sat with her bandaged hand resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on the flames as though the truth she carried was too heavy to meet Daniel's eyes, and when she finally spoke her voice was quiet yet steady, confessing that she had feared this marriage from the very moment she was told of it, not because she resented him, but because she believed she would never be wanted, that she would live as nothing more than another weight on a man, already burdened with too much. and her words cut deeper than the silence of all their earlier days. For Daniel saw now the walls she had built were not of pride but of sorrow, and with each word her trembling voice revealed the loneliness that had haunted her long before he arrived, and he could no longer hold back the truth he had kept locked away. So he told her plainly that when he came to her door it was only to honor Samuel's will, that he had believed duty alone would bind them. But as days turned into nights and struggle turned into shared fight, he had come to see her not as a burden, nor as an obligation, but as the strongest soul he had ever known. And in that moment Samuel's name became more than a memory. It became a bridge between them. For Clara's eyes softened with tears, as she whispered that she had loved Samuel as family, that his loss had left a hollow place she thought could never be filled. And Daniel nodded, admitting that his grief too had been sharp, that every acre of the ranch reminded him of his friend's laughter. And as they spoke, the weight that had kept them apart shifted into something different, something tender, for they realized they were not alone in carrying Samuel's shadow. They were bound by the same loss, and that loss gave them the rare gift of understanding. And Daniel reached for her hand, careful not to hurt the wound, but firm enough to let her feel the truth in his grip. And in the silence that followed, no storm howled, no debts pressed, no neighbors threatened, only the fragile beginning of trust, built not on promises written in a will, but on the confessions of two weary hearts, who finally dared to see each other clearly. Seasons turned and the ranch began to breathe again, not because luck favored them, but because two hearts had chosen to fight side by side. And every field they mended, every debt they paid, every night they endured together stitched, a bond stronger than the storms that once threatened to tear them apart. And Daniel, looking at Clara as she worked with quiet strength, felt the truth settle in his soul, that what began as a promise to a dead friend had become the greatest blessing of his life. For in her he found not duty but love, not burden but light. And as the Montana sun dipped behind the endless prairie, painting the sky in gold and crimson, they stood together on the porch, hands entwined, their fears gone and replaced with a peace neither had thought possible. And in that stillness Daniel whispered to himself that sometimes fate hides its gentlest gifts in the harshest disguises, leaving us to discover them only when we dare to keep a promise. And now I ask you, if you were in Daniel's place, would you honor such a vow even against your fears? Tell me in the comments. And if this story touched you, then remember to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys of love and courage here at Western Stories.